in chapter 7, with basically from chapter 6, we had this idea that so from chapter 6, we had the goal of firms is to maximize their profit. And that they maximize profit when they set their marginal revenue equal to their marginal cost. And that what that does is it determines for the firm the quantity of production. But in the equation for total revenue, we also need to know the price. Now, if you remember from the example we saw in chapter 6 with Big Macs, the price was always in that case $4. But that wouldn't always necessarily be that way. It wouldn't always be the case. So what we want to look at in this chapter and in chapter 8 is how firms organize their activities differently and how they price for goods differently based on how they're producing the product and based on the competition they face with each other. Okay, so this we already seen, so I'm not going to repeat myself. So what we want to know is, how do we define these competitive markets? And then how do firms in this kind of situation, how do they maximize profit? So what we see is that firms are generally going to be organized into industries, right? So even in, let's say, the university world here that I'm in, right, we've got competitors. My competitors would be HPU, right? Hawaii Pacific University. I'd be competing against Chaminade, and I'd be competing against all the online schools that can operate here. Kind of like your Arizona States and whatnot. Now, what that means then is that I price my good in a specific way based on that based on that type of competition. And what determines how much competition I end up having is based on how easy it is for a firm to enter or exit that industry and whether the product essentially looks different from others. So we want to look at when we compare different kinds of firms in different kinds of industries, which are collections of firms. We want to look at how these situations are different, right? If I wanted to start a car company, that's really tough, right? It's not very easy to enter or exit that industry. Whereas if I wanted to start a restaurant, it's actually pretty easy to start a restaurant, right? In the sense of like, if I had a restaurant for like grilled cheese sandwiches, well, dude, I know what the recipe is. All I need to do is go to Sam's Club, buy some cheese, buy some bread, buy some plates, and I'm GTG, right? If I wanted to start a car company, though, right, I have to get government approval. I have to do a lot of marketing because customers have to know my product. It's going to be a lot more difficult to basically enter the car industry as opposed to the restaurant industry. So when we look at these different kinds of industries, there are 4 different types of market structures: perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, oligopolies, and monopolies. Let me Well, let's look at the next slide here, and I'll give you an example of each of these. In a perfectly competitive industry, what we see is that there are many sellers, they sell similar products, and that there's free entry and exit into that industry. A good example of that would be the produce market. Like I'm talking about like fruits and veggies. Right? Fruits and vegetables, right? When you go to the grocery store, you don't really look at the name brand. Um, Prices really aren't that different from each other. Um, and it'd be pretty easy, right, to enter this industry in the sense that as long as you've got some land, buy some seeds and um, start planting them, right? Easy to enter that industry. Um, you know. Now, the alternative to this would be that I look at this from a monopolistically competitive industry. And in a monopolistically competitive industry, what starts to be different is that the products themselves are differentiated. This is the most commonly encountered competitive structure that you and I all face. That would be, well, I'm just looking, computers would be a pretty good example here, right? The computers all essentially do the same thing, but they have small differences, right? So Apple, right, is a bit more user friendly, but you can't adjust everything you want to. Whereas I could buy a computer from Dell with a Windows operating platform, and I could change a lot more. But in the computer industry as a whole, there are many sellers, pretty easy to enter the industry. The whole point of that industry is that you make a product by differentiating it from your consumers. Because on the other hand, if we try to look at Dell versus HP, the differences are pretty small between those two, and those companies suffer because of that. Whereas Apple has done a pretty good job of differentiating itself, but also too, especially for you gamers out there, if you are a gamer and you want to buy a computer, you're not going to buy a Dell or even an Apple necessarily, but you're going to probably buy Alienware, right? Which is kind of the name brand gaming computer, which is actually incidentally owned by Dell. But you can see there, right? So Dell as a company had an incentive to differentiate their gaming computers from the others. So they actually just went out and bought. Alienware used to be an independent company. They just ended up buying the whole company, right, in an attempt to, um, build profit and build a structure for themselves that way. Pause here. And so then if we look at something like oligopolies, what we see here is that the products are differentiated, but what's changing here is the number of sellers. And we also then see barriers to entry being imposed. Cars, the airlines. And what we're seeing there is that there's generally 5 to 8 sellers, right? So of all the airlines, there's essentially 7 large airlines in the United States. And right, it's not easy to start your own airline. We could look at smaller airlines, like the big one in the United States. It's trying to make its entry point would be an airline called Breeze. It's having a really hard time, and it might go bankrupt, largely because it's just a tough business to enter. Delta basically runs the show as the biggest airline in the United States, but it's not the only one where we have a monopoly. One seller selling a unique product with a lot of barriers to entry. For our Hawaii specific example, the best example of that would be Hawaiian Electric or Pasha. Well, not necessarily Pasha, but certainly Young Brothers. They do the shipping between the islands, and that's all run by Young Brothers. So typically what we see with a monopoly is that it tends to be government regulated. The government basically controls the pricing. And so if we look here, which is that they have to go through the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, which also Hawaiian Electric would do, when they want to set their prices. Okay, so what we see here, what we want to focus on here in this chapter specifically are the competitive markets. So again, that would be that there are many firms, they're each very small, and they produce a similar, if not just identical product, where there's free entry and exit. And for our purposes, what's really important is that these firms are price takers. They take the market price. And I'm sure they're going to draw in the chapter a nice picture, but let's just do one ourselves. Okay, so let's make a demand and supply graph. And let's make this product pears, the fruit. So, right, the price would be determined by the intersection of supply and demand. Let's say that it's $1 a pear. So this is going to be our industry. But Tom, pear grower, is going to be right here. And I'm just going to make a lowercase q to differentiate it from my industry q. And what we're saying here is that for me, it looks like this. I can sell as many or as few pears as I want, as long as I charge the market price. That's what it means to be a price taker. I'll repeat it, but then I'll encourage you to rewind the video if you didn't capture what I just all said. On the left-hand graph is our industry of the pear growing industry. All the pear growers out there. And what we're basically saying is that the pears don't really look that different from each other depending on what farmer grew them. But what does change things, right, is, the pear itself might not even be that essential of a product. If it is, that's okay, but it doesn't matter. But the idea is that you can't really tell which farmer made which pear. Pears look like pears, and they probably all taste the same too. So because there's no real way to differentiate an individual grower of the pears, what we would say is that the industry is determining the price of $1, but that the individual seller, me, let's say, I have to just take the market price as a given. I take the price set by the market, and now what that means is I can sell as much or as little as I want, as long as I charge the market price. In this perfectly competitive environment, there are very low to no barriers to entry. And to the extent that I can build up barriers to entry, well, then that's what makes me less competitive. That's what gives me a monopoly sort of status. And we could see, right, and you'll have a little bit of a test of this as well on the homework assignments and whatnot. But that would mean that we could look at, for instance, something like the stock market. The stock market is a business, right? That you can actually buy stock in the stock company, CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, for instance. You can buy stock in it. And what that means is that you don't have a lot of competitors for the stock market itself, like the actual market where stocks trade. And so, this is a monopoly structure. But something again like a farmer's market would be all you have to do is have a space and then you can sell your stuff because the barriers to entry in a farmer's market are very low. Then you can set for yourself a pretty low price, or at least the market price then is just determined by all the other sellers of the products. I'm just going to skip over this slide just to not confuse you before we get through the rest of the material. So what we know is that firms want to maximize their profits. This is the goal of the firm. Whether you are perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, or an oligopoly. But that would mean that they need to compare my revenue with my costs. Obviously, I want to maximize my revenue while minimizing my costs. And so to do that, well, again, I used the same equation I've been using before. Total revenue minus total costs give me my profit. Jeez Louise, look at this example. Ugh, horrible example. Why is it a horrible example? Because I think I certainly was a teenager, and I'm 48 now, so this would be 30 years ago. This episode of The Simpsons came out where Homer Simpson started a plow company. And so some of you have probably never seen The Simpsons, or you know of it because there's that character Bart Simpson, or Homer Simpson. But why would you create an example that is probably twice, well, not twice as old, but nearly twice as old as some of you in this class are? Yeah, whatever. Whatever. Just imagine this idea. A guy basically buys a truck that can plow snow. And so he decides to plow snow, and he charges a certain price per driveway, and he's obviously got certain costs. Then again, just as we looked at in the last chapter, I would compare how much my marginal revenue is to my marginal cost. How does producing one more unit change my revenue, change my costs? Again, the goal would be this. But now you may not have noticed this, but I want to highlight it for you again. Look what I wrote there. Marginal revenue. So demand equals price equals marginal revenue, which means that for the perfectly competitive firm, price is the marginal revenue, MR. Which is what we're seeing right here. Is that the marginal revenue, as the quantity changes, from 0 to 10, my revenue went up by 100. I mean, technically speaking, not 100, but rather it's $10 times 10 units, right? Because we're doing increments of 10. $10 times 10 units is 100. So the price is equal to 10. So you can see here that the quantity keeps changing by 10. And so they keep doing 10 times 10. And so you see this constant price kind of embedded in this, which is always a $10 price times 10 of the quantity, which is giving me 100. And so now what I need to do is I need to find where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, which we're finding right here. And my marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. And we also see that this is where I maximize my profit. And so what we need to do is, right, we're looking at marginal costs, we're looking at the additional costs. But whether we're actually making money or not, we also need to look at the average total cost, which would basically bring into the equation what some of my fixed costs are. Because the fixed costs are not going to be embedded in the marginal costs. Let me write that down. Fixed costs are not a part of marginal costs, right? Because fixed costs don't change with quantity. The only way I could take into account fixed costs would be if I looked at average total costs, because total costs will contain both my variable costs as well as my fixed costs. And so that's what we start to see here. So again, I would still find my quantity by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And I would see that at that point, my profit would be 10. But what we can see here is that the average total cost is 8.57, whereas my average revenue is 10, right? Because that's the price of this product. So now basically my margins, which is essentially the difference between the two, is $1.43, right? The difference between my average revenue and my average cost. That's essentially what a margin is. Right, and if you've watched any episodes of like Shark Tank or anything like that, you typically see reference to this term of the margin. Or, seen another way, that the margin would be the profit. Why are you doing that? Oh, I see. Right here. Sorry, it's because of the way he's got this written out here. This change of 10 is going from here to here. So now we would see a margin of 125, even though the total profit is the same in both situations. And so we see here at the quantity of 8, the difference of 125. With that comparison between, again, of wanting to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Where my price is 10, the marginal cost would be equal to 10 at that point, and my quantity is 8. Now, if we remind ourselves from the previous chapter, again, our goal is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. And so essentially what we see here is that in perfect competition, what can happen is that your profit can go away. And it can go away as there's more entry and exit. So how does that look? Let's insert a slide here. Pause this here. Okay, so what we would see here is that, so here's my demand and supply. Again, let's just stick with the pair market. Again, let's say that the price is $1. We're going to add a marginal cost curve here. And you can see this point where MR equals MC. What we're saying is that, though, is that if profit exists, then firms will enter the industry, right? Because there's no barriers to entry, and firms want to make money. So then what we see happening is that the supply curve shifts out, which basically shifts the supply curve to the right. I don't know, let's say 50 cents. If money is not being made, if they're losing money, and firms exit the industry, it would cause the supply curve to shift to the left. Should now raise the price. Now you're going to see a much more beautiful picture here. It's essentially here you're seeing profit going away because money was being made. Now look at this curve here. So that's our average total costs. So it's the difference between our total. Let me make a new slide here just to show this difference between the two. So let's say that it looks like this. Then my total revenue is going to be my price times my quantity. It should be my price times my quantity. It should mean that my total revenue is this whole rectangle. Total cost would be my average total cost times the quantity. And so to find that, I need an average total cost curve, which is U-shaped, and that its minimum intersects the marginal cost curve. So what we're saying is that my costs are this smaller rectangle. Which leaves that remaining as my profit. And that's what you're seeing right here. My total revenue being this rectangle. My costs being here. And essentially, again, what we're saying is that the positive profit causes entry, which lowers the price. How far does it lower the price? It lowers the price until there is no profit. Meaning, therefore, perfectly competitive firms in the long run do not make profit. And so that's what we see here. Thank you. In terms of the animation, I just showed it to you, so I would just tell you to go back to the slides I created where you see this happening. So this explains this is explaining what I did on slide 20 when I wrote it out. And this would be what I had for the, let's call it my second half of slide 20. Half of slide 20. That was when I was going from S to S double prime. Whereas here, I was going from S to S prime. It's all back here. Where again, now the price would be driven upwards. That's not letting me draw anything, so I'm just going to. So what do we see here as part of the conclusion here? Is that basically when a perfectly competitive industry is profitable, it drives more firms to it, and that the prices go down until the profits reach zero. And that when these firms are experiencing losses, firms will exit, which in turn then drives up the price until these firms can basically collectively break even. And so again, you just get a further highlight of the fact that, what we see from all this is the importance of pricing, and in this case specifically profits and losses acting as a signal to push entry and exit into the industry until it's no longer needed. And uniquely to the perfectly competitive industry, you have the situation again where these firms are price takers and that they have no impact over the price individually, only collectively when they're stuck with whatever the market price is. Okay.